The rabies virus is a member of the genus Lyssavirus in the Rhabdoviridae family. It's enveloped, single-stranded, and a negative sense RNA virus, and it has an elongated bullet shape. Rabies is a zoonotic disease, and it's spread from mammal to mammal, and it causes over 59,000 deaths per year on a global scale, mostly infecting children. And it's spread by either scratches or a bite from a rabid animal. So it's just like, zombies. Yes. And other modes of transmission are possible, but for instance, the inhalation of aerosol droplets or getting in mucous membranes, those cases are highly unlikely and extremely rare. So I mentioned zombies in the previous slide, and it's interesting how much the rabies virus has influenced our pop culture today. So a lot of the zombie movies that we see are outbreaks of a virus, and oftentimes these loop back and it ends up being a strain or a mutation of the rabies virus. So you see a violent or a crazy population. And so The Crazies in 1973 is an example of one of these movies. And then in the movie 28 Days Later, the actors were actually told to emulate the behavior of humans that had late-stage rabies to depict their zombie characters. And then I just recently read the book Cujo by Stephen King, and this actually has a lot of truth to it and how the rabies virus can be infectious in the United States today. So Cujo is an unvaccinated farm dog, and he explores in the woods, finds a hole, and he ends up getting scratched by a bat, and then he brings the rabies virus back to his farm. And this is a truthful depiction because rabies is eradicated for the most part in house pets and in humans in the US, but not really from wild animals. So the perfect combination of an unvaccinated pet and a wild animal with rabies is how the infection is transmitted in the United States today. And then Old Yeller paints a truthful depiction of rabies because it shows how every mammal can be infected. It infects their cattle in the film, and it also infects wild wolves that are around their farm. And Old Yeller contracts rabies when she goes to defend the family from these rabid wolves. So it's a sad story, but there is a ring of truth, especially for post-Civil War times before vaccines were available. So the disease mechanisms of rabies are extremely insidious as they really just hijack the central nervous system. So the infection begins at the site of the bite, and it finds the nearest nerve receptor to begin its attack. And rabies is a neurotropic virus, so it prefers to replicate in the nervous system. And while the rabies virus is heading towards the spinal cord, and that can take anywhere between 10 to 50 days, the virus can replicate in the skeletal muscle tissue along the way. And the virus travels by retrograde axoplasmatic transport mechanisms to the central nervous system, and it involves both the motor and the sensory neuron systems of the body. So once rabies has hit the central nervous system, rapid viral replication takes place, and it begins its pathological destruction on all of the nerve cells. And this is where that encephalitis sets in and causes inflammation of the brain and the spinal cord. And the virus spreads to non-nervous tissues as well, most notably the salivary glands. And this is where the viral shedding takes place, and the virus makes its mark as completing its replication cycle, as this is where the virus becomes transmissible once again. So unfortunately, once symptoms start to appear from rabies, it's made its way to the brain and spinal cord, and it's indefinitely fatal. So the bite wound, it could be painful or tingly. It could also show no symptoms. So tiny bites from bats and things, some people don't even realize that they've been bitten. And outside of the wound, the first symptoms are flu-like symptoms and nonspecific. And so sometimes the onset of the symptoms is misdiagnosed for something else. And then restlessness, confusion, hallucinations, insomnia, bizarre behaviors start to set in as the disease infiltrates the brain more and more. And saliva production begins to heavily increase. Muscle spasms start to happen in the larynx and the throat, and these are extremely painful. So drinking water can initiate these spasms. So people with rabies are often said to have hydrophobia, which is the fear of water, because they can't even take a drink. And as the virus spreads through the brain, the confusion, the agitation, and the aggressiveness get worse and worse until coma or death result. And the death can be from blockage of the airway, seizure, widespread paralysis, or exhaustion. And below is a link to a video of the man who is in the top left corner and his case of rabies. It's documented by film in the 50s in Iraq, and it's pretty difficult to watch, but it is a depiction of the progression of the rabies disease in a human. To confirm a diagnosis of rabies, skin samples, saliva, and cerebrospinal fluid samples via spinal tap are all observed under a microscope to identify the virus. And a variation of the polymerase chain reaction technique, and that's used to produce tons of copies of a gene, is used to detect the unique DNA sequence of rabies in these samples. And if the virus is suspected, these samples are taken at several times over a long span of time to increase the likelihood of finding the virus and making sure that a late onset isn't missed. Other modes of diagnostic testing are MRIs, blood tests, and animal testing if the animal is able to be obtained, and CT scans. They're used to often diagnose the rabies virus as well. And on the left, there's a picture of the rabies virus antigen fluorescing in the dog's brain tissue smear. So this is a dog that passed away from rabies, and you can just clearly see the infiltration of the rabies virus in the brain tissue. So the first step towards getting the rabies virus under control was made in 1885 by Louis Pasteur and Émile Roux, where they came up with a vaccine and they used it on a 9-year-old boy who was mauled by a rabid dog, and the vaccine proved to be a success. So in the US, there's been a huge decline in rabies infection in humans since the 70s. And this is when animal control policies were put in place and there was a mass movement to vaccinate house pets. So from 2008 to 2017, there were 23 total cases of human rabies, 8 of which originated outside of the US during travels. And with domestic house pets, there are 60 to 70 dogs and over 250 cats that are reported to have rabies each year in the US. All of these cases are pets that have not been vaccinated, and they contract the virus from a wild animal, just like our friend Cujo a few slides back. So please, please vaccinate your fur babies. I know that my little ones are curious, and you just never know who they'll find when they're exploring. So this is a pretty cool map that shows which animals pose the biggest threat in whatever region of the United States that you're in. For instance, my dad had to go through the series of rabies shots because he was bit by a bat, and my dad lives in Ohio. So take a look at where you live and see what animals are the biggest threat to you. So with the U.S. seeing 1 to 3 cases of rabies per year, that leaves the other 58,997 plus cases to worry about elsewhere in the world. These are mostly in Africa and Asia, as you can see in the red endemic zones on the map. Mostly these cases are children, and 99% of them are due to dog bites. So the rabies virus mostly affects impoverished populations where they have limited healthcare and veterinary systems. So the World Health Organization and organizations like United Against Rabies and Mission Rabies are working together toward a common goal to eradicate human rabies by the year 2030. So for treatment and therapy strategies, prevention is key. So of course, avoid being bitten by animals, especially wild ones. And it's not really that hard to depict a rabid animal. They usually have very abnormal behavior. So if a wild animal is not afraid when you approach them, or if a bat is out during the day or having trouble flying or making weird noises, and then if animals are just aggressive without being provoked, or if an animal is weak or vicious or agitated, just call animal control. Never try to help a sick animal, because they often bite and you just never know. It could be infected with rabies. And rabies vaccination should be given to people who are likely to be exposed to the virus, such as cave explorers or veterinarians and the lab workers who test the animals who have died from rabies. So for treatment and therapy strategies after a bite, immediately clean the wound with soap and water, as this can save your life. Deep puncture wounds should be flushed out with running water and see a doctor immediately. Doctors attempt to distinguish if rabies was likely transmitted through a series of questions. So they ask what type of animal it was, if the animal appeared to be sick, if the animal is available for observation, and they decide if medicine should be administered. And there's no rapid test that can detect rabies immediately after a bite. So people that have been bitten, they may be treated with the rabies immune globulin and a vaccine by injection. And the immune globulin contains antibodies against the rabies virus and provides short-lived but immediate protection, while the vaccine stimulates the body to produce its own antibodies against the virus, and that's a much longer-lived span of protection, but it takes a really long time to build up. So the combination is given for immediate and long-term protection from the rabies virus. And again, sadly, if the symptoms have already set in, there's nothing that can be done, and comfort measures are taken to make the patient as comfortable as possible. So now I'm going to cover Western equine encephalitis, Eastern equine encephalitis, and Venezuelan equine encephalitis. These viruses all have some things in common. They're all arboviruses spreading their infection via mosquito and tick vectors. They cause fatal neurologic disease in horses and incidental infection in humans. And they're all alphaviruses and part of the togavirus family. These viruses are all enveloped, non-segmented, single-stranded, positive sense RNA viruses. These three viruses generally have the same life and transmission cycles. So the primary transmission cycle is depicted in the picture, and it's from mosquito to bird, and then occasionally they go off-roading and find an incidental host in a human or a horse or another animal. Venezuelan equine encephalitis is an exception among the three because it can spread from the horse or the human via mosquito, whereas with the other two, the horse is the end game. And then mosquitoes incidentally infect humans. So the main reservoir for Western equine encephalitis is the Culiseta melanura mosquito, which actually feeds almost exclusively on birds. So when other mosquitoes by happenstance feed on infected birds, that's when that incidental transmission happens with humans and horses. The Western equine encephalitis virus enters the subcutaneous tissue via a mosquito bite. After that, the virus works its way to a local lymph node where it begins replication, and it also begins RNA and protein synthesis. Viremia follows the lymph node infection, and if the viral load is high enough, the virus can cross that protective blood-brain barrier and enter the central nervous system. This infiltration leads to that encephalitis. So in most cases, they are subclinical. Symptomatic cases typically present with flu-like symptoms, and they spontaneously resolve on their own. The neuroinvasive infection usually takes place in very young or the very elderly. Vertigo, photophobia, coma, seizures, confusion, agitation, these are all common symptoms in these cases. Children develop neurological symptoms more quickly and are more likely to have permanent neurological disability due to the infection, where the elderly are more likely to pass away from it. And people who do recover from this acute neurologic disease may experience headaches, irritability, and fatigue for years to come after the infection. So most cases of Western equine encephalitis occur west of the Mississippi River, west of the Rocky Mountains, and in California, as you can see noted in the map on the left. Warm weather and heavy rainfall are common predecessors of these epidemics. They're most common in rural areas, and the peak months to be infected are in July and August. The largest outbreak occurred in 1941 with over 3,000 confirmed cases, and since 1964 there have been less than 700 cases reported. And the annual incidence report is highly variable due to periods of intermittent inactivity with just random spurts of outbreaks. So infants are most commonly infected with Western equine encephalitis and have a higher risk of permanent neurologic disability, while adults are more commonly targeted by the mosquitoes, but they don't become infected as often. The elderly and small children are at the highest risk for neurologic manifestation and death. And the reported infectivity rates are 1 in 1,000 for adults, 1 in 58 for children aged 1 to 4, and 1 for 1 in infants. The mode of action for Eastern equine encephalitis is very similar to what we just saw in Western. So the virus is injected by a mosquito, it travels and replicates in the bloodstream, and may eventually cross the blood-brain barrier into the CNS, ultimately leading in encephalitis. Eastern equine encephalitis is considered to be one of the most severe mosquito-borne illnesses in the United States, as 1 in 3 people who contract the severe form die within 10 days of initial symptoms. So this virus can also present as a mild case resembling the flu, and it can last for up to 2 weeks and it'll go away on its own. Severe Eastern equine encephalitis also begins with flu-like symptoms, but about 4 days in, the signs of brain infection start to appear. Headache, drowsiness, and confusion may occur, typically worsening very quickly, resulting in seizures, coma, and possibly death. With Eastern equine encephalitis, we again see that the young and the old are at the greatest risk for severe Eastern equine encephalitis. Only 4 to 5% of these infections result in actual encephalitis. An average of 7 Eastern equine encephalitis cases are reported annually in the United States. Most cases are seen east of the Mississippi River, with the most prevalence seen in Florida, Massachusetts, New York, and North Carolina. And these locations are typically in swampy, hardwood regions. So again, for Venezuelan equine encephalitis, we see that same mode of action. So the mosquito bites, the virus travels and replicates in the blood, possibly crosses that blood-brain barrier into the central nervous system. And something special about Venezuelan equine encephalitis is that it can also be transmitted via aerosol droplets. So the virus typically presents with nonspecific and flu-like symptoms, and they can range from mild to severe, and they appear 2 to 5 days after the first exposure to the virus. 4 to 14% of cases develop neurological complications that lead to encephalitis, and fatalities account for 1% of infections. Venezuelan equine encephalitis can cause leukopenia, tachycardia, and severe headaches, and symptoms associated with encephalitis include convulsions, coma, confusion, and photophobia. Death due to Venezuelan equine encephalitis is typically due to the encephalitis plus brain, GI, and lung hemorrhaging. So long-term neurological effects are in line with what we've seen for Western and Eastern equine encephalitis. And Venezuelan equine encephalitis has the ability to cross the placenta, and that can lead to congenital birth defects or stillbirth. Venezuelan equine encephalitis has shown up in Argentina, in Florida, the Rocky Mountains, but the highest prevalence is in northern South America. The first outbreaks were reported in Colombia and Venezuela and Trinidad in 1935. In the 1960s, over 200,000 human cases and 100,000 equine deaths were reported in Colombia. And between 75,000 and 100,000 cases were reported in Venezuela and Colombia in 1995. So large outbreaks occur after a season of heavy rain. And vaccinations of horses and protection against mosquitoes by protective clothing and pesticides are some of the proposed ways to decrease Venezuelan equine encephalitis outbreaks. All 3 of these viruses can be diagnosed by serology in humans, and it can be used in 3 different ways. So they can look for a specific IgM in the cerebrospinal fluid. They can look for a greater than a 4-fold increase in paired titers and other serological tests, and they can look for the conversion from IgM to IgG. In some cases, they can be detected directly with virus isolation or with tests to detect viral antigens. So prevention is thought to be the key when it comes to these equine encephalitis diseases for humans and for animals. So insect repellent, putting up mosquito nets, and they do have vaccination for horses for these viral encephalitis diseases, but they don't have any for humans. So unfortunately, there are no human antiviral drugs that have proven to work on any of these equine encephalitis diseases, and treatment just consists of supportive care with IV fluids, hospitalization, prevention from other infections, and ventilation if needed. Thank you all so much for listening. I hope that you found the information as intriguing and interesting as I did. So good luck with everything coming up, and thanks again. Bye. Hi everyone, this is Evelyn Taylor. I'm doing my presentation on rabies, Western equine encephalitis, Eastern equine encephalitis, and Venezuelan equine encephalitis.